All right. So once again, thanks everybody for taking some time out of your day here to join us for another Lunch and Learn installment. This is the third in our Misinformation series, and I'm delighted to welcome Andrew O'Pace, who's going to visit with us today. I'm going to do a quick introduction, and actually, the subject of his talk is going to be slightly different than what was posted on social media, but there's actually an interesting backstory to that, which I'll let Andrew share with you. So, Dr. Andrew O'Pace is a historian of the U.S. and the world who specializes in the moral fog of war. He is currently a DPAA Research Partner Fellow in the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society at the University of Southern Mississippi. He completed his PhD in U.S. history at the University of Colorado Boulder in 2023, and he is now working on his first book manuscript about the reversal in U.S. foreign policy from victory at all costs in World War II to peace at any price during the Vietnam War. Andrew has worked as a podcast host for the Diplomatic History Channel on the New Books Network, as a brick wall genealogist for Ancestry, and holds an MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago and an Honors BA in History from the University of Utah. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Andrew so we can hear, and I'll hear myself for the first time, what the topic of his talk is today. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks for that introduction. Can everybody hear me all right? Sometimes my sound is a little off. Thanks so much for having me for this Lunch and Learn. And I am sorry again about this sort of bait and switch. If you came here hoping to hear about the POW MIA controversy in Vietnam, I'm still planning to present on that. We're aiming for next month. But I can't talk about that today, and I want to talk a little bit about why. So as Dr. Fay said, I'm the DPAA Research Partner Fellow here at Southern Miss, which means that I am employed by the university here, but 90% of my day-to-day job is with the Defense Department. And specifically, I work with the DPAA, that's the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. So I'm actually required to tell you that I do not work for DPAA. I support DPAA through a partnership, and the views that I present are my own and do not necessarily represent the views of DPAA, DoD, or its components. So this agency is the agency in the Defense Department that's responsible for researching, locating, and recovering missing military personnel. So anytime you see a newspaper article that says, an airplane pilot who was shot down in Vietnam 50 years ago or in World War II 80 years ago and has been recovered and the body has been brought home and buried with full honors at Arlington or in a local cemetery, that's this agency. So I work with them. I'm a historian by training, so I work with this agency on various projects to try and find clues or leads that might be fruitful. And if I find anything that seems promising, then there are teams, underwater teams, mountaineering teams, very much sort of Indiana Jones types who are sent into the Philippines or into Germany or into the Mediterranean or wherever the case is located, and they try to find whatever remains might be available. After that, I guess I would say it kind of becomes like a Bones episode. If you've seen Bones, the TV show, the largest Bones lab in the world is actually in Hawaii, belonging to the DPAA, and there are all kinds of really capable and intelligent people there who work to identify the remains that are recovered. So as you can imagine, this work is really interesting. There's a lot of science, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of archaeology involved, but especially when it comes to the Vietnam War, which wasn't actually all that long ago, 50 years ago, it is incredibly all of this work is an incredibly emotional experience for family members and relatives who are involved. It's very close to home for them, obviously. And so the agency and the Defense Department as a whole are very, very sensitive to anybody sharing um, information about their work and talking about family members or relatives. So everything that I present at a conference or at a lunch and learn, any paper that I submit has to be first submitted to the agency for review. And there's a number of review processes that take place as the agency makes sure that I'm not saying anything that I shouldn't be saying. They make sure that I'm not, uh, disclosing things I shouldn't or saying anything that might cause harm to the agency or cause harm or distress to family members and relatives. So that's and for a number of reasons, which I can talk about next time, Vietnam is especially it's just an especially sensitive topic. Um, so the agency is uh, very um, very careful with everything that is presented. So at the last, because I'm still waiting for some approvals to talk about the Vietnam project in specifically, we decided to move forward and talk about some World War II research that I've been working on instead. So that's a little bit of background about why the topic that was advertised is not the topic that I'm presenting on today. But as I said, the goal is still to talk about Vietnam and the POW MIA controversy next month. So this will be a little bit of a teaser for that. And next month after I get everything approved, will be very, very interesting. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Can everybody see this? All right. So today I'm actually going to talk about um, a famous, I guess what I would call misinformation massacre. This is a case where information and evidence were fabricated in order to perpetuate a horrific war crime. So I want to talk today about Lidice, which is a Czech village that was destroyed by the Nazis in June 1942 in retaliation for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. My research on this topic focuses on the uniqueness of this particular war crime, and I want to show how its really unparalleled destruction led to an unparalleled response by the Western Allies and the international community as they tried to remember Lidice. In order to understand that transnational movement, though, we have to understand how the village was annihilated. So our story begins today with Operation Anthropoid. Some of you may be familiar with this. This was the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. That's him here in the middle of that picture on the right. He was assassinated by two Czech partisans in May, and in May of 1942, he actually died in June. But Heydrich was the acting Reichsprotector or administrator of the former Czechoslovakia that had been annexed into the Third Reich shortly before World War II began. And Heydrich was undoubtedly one of the darkest figures in the Third Reich. He was one of the authors of The Final Solution, the Holocaust, and in many ways, he was the poster boy for Nazism. In fact, with his blonde hair and Aryan features, he was kind of living propaganda. Um, Hitler called him the man with the iron heart, but after Heydrich was sent to Prague in September 1941, Czechs called him the hangman, or the butcher of Prague, because of his brutality towards the local population. In fact, Heydrich had so many Czechs shot or deported to concentration camps that the exiled Czech government in London began plotting to assassinate him. The two assassins, Joseph Gabčík, a Slovak, and Jan Kubis, a Czech, made their wills on December 28th, 1941, because this was going to be a suicide mission. They were expected to die. And then they parachuted into the protectorate. So then on May 27th, 1942, after several months of observation and planning and networking, Kubis and Gabčík stationed themselves near a hairpin curve on the road leading from Heydrich's home to Prague Castle. And as Heydrich's Mercedes slowed around this curve, the two men jumped out and attacked with a machine gun, which jammed, and then threw a bomb against the side of his car, which exploded and threw shrapnel everywhere, which became embedded into his stomach. So this is a photograph here of his Mercedes convertible after the attack. And Heydrich was wounded by this bomb and then died a week later on June 4th, 1942. He was the highest ranking Nazi official killed during the war. The Czech village of Lidice was a small mining town about 12, it was in the industrial district of Kladno. It was about 12 miles northwest of Prague. And it contained about 500 predominantly Catholic inhabitants. It was first picked up by the Gestapo's radar in the fall of 1941 when officers suspected wrongly that two local families were serving as contacts for the the French resistance, the Czech resistance. There were additional allegations based on limited and inaccurate evidence that led German security forces to link this village with Heydrich's assassination, even though there was no real connection. Nazi leaders in Prague then called Heinrich Himmler in Berlin and reported that the assassins had supposedly received support from village residents. Himmler then reported to Hitler, who decided that the village should be razed. So on June 10th, 1942, all the inhabitants of Lidice were rounded up and assembled in the town square. The men were summarily executed by firing squads. The women were deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. 9 of the children were selected for Aryanization, which means that they received new German names, new identification papers, and new German parents from the SS. The remaining children were deported to the death camp at Chełmno, where they were murdered in the gas chambers on July 2nd. In all, 199 men were executed and 340 residents of Lidice were murdered. The village was then burned and demolished with explosives. Rumors persisted for a while that some men may have survived the massacre, but every evidence indicates that none did. More than a year after the killings, the New York Times reported that a man named Karl Horek was the lone survivor from Lidice. Allegedly, he escaped the execution because he had stayed too long at a cafe in Prague, and then he missed his bus and had to hitchhike home. When he supposedly arrived back at his hometown, it was on fire. And then he tried to make his way to France and England by using underground resistance networks, but he vanished. I have not been able to find any information confirming whether he was caught and killed, as the Times suspected. And I question whether this story about a lone survivor is even accurate. In part, I'm skeptical because the Gestapo assiduously tracked down and executed the men who had avoided the initial roundup. So there were, for instance, 11 men working the night shift in a nearby factory. There was a man with a broken leg at a nearby hospital and a man who'd been hiding in the woods for 3 days. The Gestapo found them, arrested them, and had them executed. Pregnant women were taken to the same hospital where Heydrich died, where they were forced to give birth and then sent to concentration camps. Their newborns were promptly seized by German authorities and then delivered over to German foster families. So this massacre was obviously extreme, but it was not exceptional. The German army conducted anti-partisan operations throughout its conquest during World War II. And since murder was really their standard operating procedure, there were thousands of Lidicas in Poland, Yugoslavia, Greece, and the Soviet Union, where the men were shot, the women and children were deported, and the village was razed. But Lidice was not just destroyed, it was erased. The Germans drove all of the village cattle to a German farm. They exhumed, plundered, and destroyed every grave in the village cemetery. And then a Nazi German labor service worked for more than a year to permanently transform the topography of Lidice. First, they dispersed the rubble from the buildings to make the landscape unrecognizable. Then they rerouted a stream through the village. They removed all of the trees from the area. And then they imported 84,000 square meters of soil to level the land. They finally planted grain over the former village and made the southern area a grazing ground for sheep. This is unusual because the German army destroyed villages and altered landscapes all across Europe. But this was different because, as one historian wrote, the topographical restructuring was the primary aim, not merely an incidental result. By order of the Fuhrer, the village of Lidice was wiped completely off the face of the earth. Hitler even had Lidice wiped off the map. 1 year after the massacre, the main survey department of the Third Reich published a revised series of topographic maps of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. Lidice was nowhere to be found. So on the left, you can see this is the image from the topographic map series from 1938. And the image on the right is the revised topographic map from 1942. And as you can see, the place where Lidice once was and where it should be, there's just nothing listed there. So Nazi cartographers had removed the village as though it had never existed. And by making Lidice disappear, Hitler attempted to eradicate Lidice from history. The village had no material past after the Nazis. And if they had completely succeeded, there would have been no collective memory because there would have been no survivors and no witnesses. In short, the destruction of Lidice was nothing less than an attempt to mutilate time and space, which made Lidice different from other German war crimes in World War II. German atrocities during World War II were also usually racially driven, either by anti-Semitism or anti-Slavism, but Lidice was a Czech town filled with Catholics. And while there were lots of German generals and army officers who had to deal with snipers in war zones and assassination attempts, Bohemia was part of the Third Reich. So this wasn't a war zone. This was part of Nazi Germany at this point. So the violence here is internal and it's personal. And unlike other atrocities, enraged or drunken German soldiers didn't run amok through the village, nor did they carry out their usual anti-partisan commands. Rather, Lidice's special extermination order was given directly by Adolf Hitler. After he had first heard of the attack on Heydrich, Hitler had initially ordered the execution of 10,000 Czechs. His subordinates talked him down, but the shootings, deportations, and obliteration of Lidice all proceeded from Hitler's decree. As one journalist reported, it was, quote, the will of Hitler that Lidice should vanish from the earth and be forgotten among men. What made Lidice unique and ultimately famous, however, was the fact that the Germans erased the village and then they publicized the erasure to the world. So during the war in the East, German massacres were largely secret, but Lidice was broadcast on Radio Prague. The communique read in part, I have an excerpt here, says, as the inhabitants of this village have, by their support of the murderers of SS Obergruppenführer Heydrich, offended in the most flagrant fashion against the laws that have been issued, the grown men have been shot, the women taken to a concentration camp, and the children sent to be given appropriate education. The buildings in the village have been razed to the ground, and the name of the village obliterated. The Third Reich also released a film of the shootings, burnings, and transformation of the region. Now, it may seem counterintuitive to erase Lidice and then publicize its erasure, but I argue that the goals of Nazi violence and propaganda were the same. The destruction of Lidice was never meant to be secret, hidden, private, or indiscriminate. Rather, Hitler ordered the village's annihilation to send a message to Czechs, to occupied Europe, and the world. The destruction of Lidice, therefore, was a performance that showcased the totality of Nazi domination, the inevitability of Nazi victory, and the futility of resistance. Tragically, 2 weeks later, the village of Lizaki became Liditza's twin after Gestapo agents connected that village to Heydrich's death. On June 24th, German soldiers shot all 33 adults in Lizaki. They delivered the children to German authorities and razed the village. The massacre and deportation of civilians and the razing of villages had all happened before and would all happen again in thousands of other places, but the erasure of Lidice on Hitler's direct orders and the boastful broadcast of the annihilation were unprecedented. The punitive violence against Heydrich's killers and the preventive violence to deter further attacks were all monstrously typical for the Nazis, but the performative violence was singular. Now, as you can imagine, the destruction of Lidice horrified, shocked, and outraged the Allies and the United Nations. The world had already witnessed or heard about the destruction of Warsaw, Rotterdam, and Coventry, but the Allies considered Lidice unparalleled because it had been specifically destroyed on Hitler's orders, involved levels of destruction that were extreme even for World War II, and then was publicized and condemned to eternal oblivion. The atrocity made headlines around the world. Nothing in modern history is more inhuman than Hitler's action against the little village of Lidice, the new republic declared. Wendell Willkie, who was the Republican presidential nominee in 1940, affirmed that Lidice represented a unique crime, a medieval atrocity in the modern world. Lidice, he stated, was, quote, more terrible than anything that has happened since the Dark Ages. In Australia, the Daily Telegraph concluded that Lidice was, quote, the worst atrocity committed by a civilized nation in modern times. Lidice therefore became, in the words of one scholar, the international symbol of Nazi inhumanity. Once the Holocaust was more fully known, Auschwitz became and remains the historical metonym of evil. But during the war, Lidice was worldwide shorthand for Nazi barbarism. Lidice showed what we were fighting for and what we were fighting against, said the Saturday Review of Literature. An Edmonton editorial compared the Nazis to Attila the Hun and wrote, quote, they are the least civilized people in the world. They are literal barbarians. The Australian Goulburn Evening Post asked, can we belong to the same species as this? Even the wild animals stopped when they are surfeited. At the U.S. Office of War Information, the American artist Ben Shahn created a poster called This is Nazi Brutality, which used Lidice to represent the horrors of Nazism by superimposing an abridged version of the German broadcast on a hooded figure in shackles, which was the image that I used in my title slide. As Lidice became the archetype of Nazi brutality, the Allies turned it into a powerful anti-Nazi symbol. And some of the Allies' strongest propaganda about Lidice was published in this small book, edited by Nicholas Ballant, entitled Lidice Lives Forever. Ballant was a Czech Jew who had fled with his family to Britain and then emigrated to the United States in August 1941. After learning of Lidice's destruction, he published the story of the massacre in order to, quote, realize the nature of our enemy, steel us to hate him implacably, and teach us why we must destroy him utterly. Lidice thus hardened Allied hearts. In a radio broadcast to the U.S. The day after the massacre, Jan Masaryk, the Czech foreign minister in exile, declared, quote, sympathy and condemnation are not enough. It seems to me that the time has come to pay the Germans in kind. To my mind, it should be 10 teeth for one and 10 eyes for one. We must be as ruthless as they are. U.S. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox announced, if future generations ask us what we are fighting for in this war, we shall tell them the story of Lidice. The British War Office similarly reported, each time it is remembered, mankind becomes a little more determined that the thing which tried to kill Lidice shall itself be killed, shall be driven from the earth so that no Lidice will ever die again. Indeed, many commentators demanded not only an eye for an eye, but a city for a city, and Lidice became one of the justifications for the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany. More than anything else, though, the extraordinary destruction of Lidice provoked the Allies to remember and memorialize the atrocity. And inasmuch as the Nazis attempted to eradicate Lidice from history, they were thwarted by the international response. The New York Times reported that Lidice was, quote, written in blood in every man's atlas. It blazes in undying fire on every map of Europe. What happened there will never be forgiven, never forgotten. In her syndicated column, Eleanor Roosevelt promised, none of us will ever forget a little village named Lidice. What the Germans thought to do away with forever will be remembered the world over. Indeed, the Allies vowed to remember the destruction of Lidice precisely because the Nazis had tried to make everyone forget. The exiled German novelist Thomas Mann wrote, they wanted to consign the name of Lidice to eternal oblivion, and they have engraved it forever into the memory of man by their atrocious deed. Hardly anyone knew this name before they murdered the entire population and razed the settlement to the ground. Now it is world famous. 1 year after the massacre, a Washington editorial stated, this once unknown village has achieved a fame unique in world history. There is hardly a literate man or woman or child who has not heard its story. 1,000 times every day, the name that was not to be remembered is remembered. So Allied rhetoric about resistance, retaliation, and remembrance was all typical. But the Allies were particularly disturbed by the Nazis' unique attempt to erase all traces of Lidice. And this unique tragedy provoked a unique form of resistance among the Allies. To protest and reverse the Nazis' attempts to erase Lidice from history and from geography, communities across the Western Hemisphere renamed towns, parks, streets, and even children after Lidice. In Great Britain, activists formed the Lidice Shall Live movement to raise money to rebuild the village after the war. In the United States, concerned citizens formed their own Lidice Lives movement, which included celebrities like Albert Einstein and Charlie Chaplin. And the executive committee published and promoted Nicholas Ballan's book about the massacre. They commissioned a dramatic verse called The Murder of Lidice, and they championed the establishment of a new Lidice in Illinois. Because the Nazis sought to erase the name of Lidice, Americans protested and resisted by looking for a way for the name of the village to live on. So on July 12, 1942, 1 month after Lidice was destroyed, as many as 50,000 people gathered for the ceremony as Stern Park Gardens, a federal defense housing project of about 100 homes near Crest Hill, Illinois, was renamed Lidice. A granite monument in the center of town was erected with the following dedication. In memory of the people of Lidice, Czechoslovakia, destroyed by barbarism, but living forever in the heart of all who love freedom, this monument is erected by the free people of America's Lidice, Illinois. Lidice lives. In the ceremonial keynote speech, Wendell Willkie quoted the official Nazi pronouncement from Radio Prague and pled for both memory and retribution, vowing to remember if only because the Nazis themselves demand that we must forget it. Many commentators wrote that Lidice lived on because its name survived, even if its people or buildings did not. The new Lidice made the Czech town immortal, and many found solace knowing that there were some things that the Nazis could not kill or destroy. Others found the ceremony less profound. Thus, the name which the Nazis thought they had extinguished will be mispronounced for all time, quipped the New Yorker. Most Americans happily began calling the new town Lidice, while Time magazine reported that the Czech consulate in Chicago gave the official pronunciation as Lidice. In Joliet, they pronounced it the new subdivision. The act of defying the Nazis by using the name of Lidice started a chain reaction of adoption ceremonies throughout the Western Hemisphere. The Lidice Lives Committee designated October 25, 1942 as Lidice Memorial Day and tried to persuade 31 towns, one for each of the United Nations, to adopt the name of Lidice on that day. Accordingly, Stern Park Gardens, Illinois was soon followed on August 30th by San Jeronimo Aculco in Mexico. The name of Lidice became particularly prominent in Latin America as towns, parks, and streets commemorated the atrocity. In Brazil, the town of Parado in the Rio Claro district was renamed Lidice on June 10, 1944, as was a neighborhood in Uberlandia in the Minas Gerais state. Northeast of Rio de Janeiro, the town of Villa Progreso and the town of Bahia was renamed Nova, or New Liritza. In Panama, the village of Potrero in the district of Capira was renamed Liritza on October 31st, 1943. Grassroots movements sprung up in seemingly obscure places as sympathetic journalists and local civic officials jumped on the commemorative bandwagon, while Czech emigres sought to remember a national tragedy. Thus far, I have located a city district and monument in Callao, Lima, Peru, streets in Santiago, Rancagua, Puente Alto, and Viña del Mar, Chile, a square in Quito, Ecuador, a plaza in Montevideo, Uruguay, and in Cuba, a plaza in the Zanja district of Havana, a neighborhood in Regla, and streets in Caibarien that have all been renamed for Liritza. I've also found streets in Panama, a workers' suburb in Venezuela, a park in Tolima, Colombia, and memorials in Coventry, Goole, and Stoke-on-Trent, England, and another one in Phillips, Wisconsin. There are also unconfirmed reports of Liritzas in Canada, Hungary, Israel, Russia, and South Africa, which I am still looking for. This naming or renaming practice even extended to children, as Czech and Latin American families named their baby girls Liritza, which remains a familiar name in many Latin American nations to this day. These renaming efforts were not always successful, though. Despite reports that Fredericksburg, Quebec, on the Vermont border would be the third Liritza in October 1942, the name of the town was never changed. Provincial authorities apparently approved the new name, and the U.S. committee announced their decision, but apparently no one in the province had asked the Fredericksburg town mayor or its 500 residents, and the city council ultimately rejected the proposal. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, the victors cited Liritza as an example of Nazi criminality, and the village itself finally received a measure of justice with the post-war trials of protectorate officials in 1946 and 47. Before he was hanged in April 1947, Harold Weizmann, who was the Gestapo chief in the Kladno district, confessed that the evidence implicating Liritza in Heydrich's murder had been fabricated in order to make the town an example of German vengeance. There was no connection, there was never any connection between Liritza and Heydrich's assassination. The village was just destroyed as an arbitrary reprisal for Heydrich's death. After the war, Liritza's exceptional violence was eclipsed by the immensity and monstrosity of the Holocaust. And as transnational memorialization faded, Czech President Edvard Beneš kept Liritza alive as the keystone of Nazi martyrology and national identity. And the Beneš government would go on to use Liritza to punish Nazi criminals, expel ethnic Germans through the Beneš decrees, and to solidify Czech nationalism. On the third anniversary of Liritza, President Beneš stood at the site of the massacre in June 1945 and asked, "What does Liritza really signify in all this horrible phase of Nazism? This Liritza which has become such a mournfully notorious example of German torture and slaughter." Answering his own question, Beneš declared that Liritza was both representative and unique. On the one hand, Liritza and its fate are a most characteristic expression of German Nazi culture and of the German Nazi system, he explained. On the other hand, Liritza was also anomalous. Beneš explained, what most dumbfounded the whole world in the matter of the Liritza crime was that immediately after the slaughter of the innocent population of Liritza, a slaughter devised in cold blood and carried out with the vilest cynicism, there was issued an official German communique in which the German government boasted of this cruel deed and showed that it was a reprisal inflicted upon admittedly innocent people, that it was purely an act of murderous terrorism committed as a warning. It was not concealed, it was not hushed up, it was publicly proclaimed to the entire German people. Soviet soldiers and Czech workers had created the first memorial at Liritza, and the Czech government broke ground for the new Liritza in a ceremony in June 1947. With funds raised by the Lidice Shall Live movement in Britain, the new Lidice was completed in 1949, overlooking the field where the old village once stood. And amazingly, 143 surviving women and 17 children returned to start their lives anew. The old Lidice included an international memorial and a national park, while a rose garden, museum, and art gallery were added later. After the Czech coup in 1948, however, the communist government turned Lidice into an anti-fascist shrine. The whole village became a living museum, and until 1989, Lidice mostly provided political propaganda for the Eastern Bloc. After the Velvet Revolution overthrew the communist government in 1989, however, Lidice was turned over to new owners, and today the memorial complex includes a plaza and fountain, an education center, and a memorial hall. However, Lidice remains infamous as a symbol of total annihilation and stands out among memorial spaces because of the absence of physical remains. In conclusion, Czech historians and the Czech government still tell the story of Lidice to portray the heroism and patriotism of their people who won their nation its freedom. For example, one common story about Lidice is that the men defiantly sang the Czech national anthem before they were shot and shouted, "Long live Beneš and freedom." The commemorations in the Czech Republic, Illinois, Mexico, Cuba, and elsewhere continue to this day due to traditions and the influence of the Czech Republic Embassy and the international Czech community. Czechs and the Western Allies saw Lidice as a unique atrocity during World War II. The unprecedented destruction provoked an unprecedented reaction as attempts to remember and reconstruct Lidice became a transnational movement. The scale of the Holocaust has since surpassed Lidice, and 21st century memorials persist largely due to the influence of Czech culture. Nevertheless, Lidice remains a forceful paradigm of Nazi barbarism, and where and when it is remembered makes for an exceptionally powerful sign of resistance, if only because the Nazis themselves demanded that we must forget it. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. I'll get us started with a question here. So I am also dumbfounded, like Benish, of the effort to celebrate this massacre, because I think, as we talked about yesterday in my office, like we're at least as if not more accustomed to these authoritarian regimes doing dastardly crimes and then covering them up or blaming them on each other. Like, I know we talked about the Katyn massacre yesterday. So do you know why was the German government keen to advertise this so openly on like German radio and stuff in ways that they weren't, obviously the death camps and other things which were largely kept from public view?
Yeah, I think like I mentioned, it's the violence is punitive, it's preventive, and it's performative. There's certainly a punitive aspect to Lidice. It's meant as a reprisal for Heydrich's death, and the orders given directly by Adolf Hitler, and so he seems to have had a penchant for total destruction. He would order the total destruction of Warsaw and Paris and even Berlin in the final days of the war. He was just an enormously violent person. But he ordered the destruction as a way to, like, what he saw as punishment for Heydrich's death. But it's also meant as a warning. It's meant to send a message to Czechs specifically that any resistance to the Nazi regime will be met with total destruction. And part of what's interesting too is that it was the massacre was really successful in terms of destroying Czech resistance. The Nazis spent the next few weeks rounding up anybody who they could conceivably connect to Heydrich's assassination, anybody connected to the French resistance, or sorry, Czech resistance. There were two sort of main resistance organizations. They were both largely eliminated in that summer of 1942. And for the rest of the war, the former Czechoslovakia, this protectorate became a kind of model um, region of the Third Reich. People were so terrorized by these massacres and by all of the people in Prague who were, deported or executed, that there was basically no resistance after that. Um, so in terms of its preventive goals, it was really successful. Um, but as I've pointed out, I think it's also performative. It's meant
Hmm.
to showcase how powerful the Third Reich is, um, how futile it is to resist their power, and how inevitable it is that they're going to ultimately prevail. Um, but it is, this is a case that has always perplexed me, um, in part because the levels of destruction are so extreme. Rerouting a stream through the village, taking out the trees, removing all of the graves. It's just overkill on
Hmm.
every level. Um, but I think it is. I think it's meant to be performative. It's meant to exhibit how powerful the Nazis are.
Thanks very much. Other questions from people, and you can feel free to either ask it openly or post something in the chat. I'm sure we can monitor that too.
Yeah, I'll ask one. Andrew, I'm not a German historian, but what's the role of the Catholic Church here? Didn't it have some power itself and its own ability to counteract some of these claims? And what was your understanding here of the role it played, especially if the majority of people here are Catholic?
That's a great question. Um, I'm not aware of any kind of reaction from the Catholic Church. Um, Pope Pius XII has long been a really controversial figure during World War II, because of what he did or didn't do in response to the Nazis. Um, and I suspect that there isn't much of a Catholic reaction because, um, religion isn't the motivation for the massacre. They're not killed because they're Catholics. Um, they just, it just is a town where most of the people happen to be Catholic. Um, but there are in the aftermath of the massacre, there are some interesting interpretations or appropriations for the massacre. Um, the Czechs see this as a national tragedy. They don't see it as having anything to do with religion, or really anything to do with sort of the universal values of human freedom. This is a national catastrophe that has taken place uh, because these people are Czech. The Allies, in contrast, view Czech victims as sort of stand-ins for the Allied cause writ large. They see this as a very black and white narrative. This is tyranny destroying freedom, and this isn't a religious massacre. This isn't. They sort of elide the fact that these are Czech victims. They just focus on the fact that these are victims of tyranny. And Beneš and his government after the war spend a lot of time trying to focus other people on the fact that these people are Czechs, that the reason they were killed is because they were Czech. So I would be very interested actually to get into some more Catholic records and see if there was a kind of formal protest from the Vatican or from Catholics around the world, but there doesn't seem to be much, uh, I guess, Catholic solidarity with the victims of Lidice.
I think Ashlyn, did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry if I missed this, but I'm just curious as to what got you into this research. Like, what was your inspiration for shining a light on these stories?
Yeah, I this this started as a seminar paper as a graduate student. I had a class on European violence, and this I chose this topic because I had heard the story of this massacre, and I was, like I said, perplexed with the overkill. Why was this so extreme? There were, as I mentioned, literally thousands of other cases where the German army, wiped out a village, shot the inhabitants, deported them to concentration camps. That's just, I mean, that was their standard operating procedure in Eastern Europe. But this seemed to be different. This seemed to be even more extreme, destroying the village and then erasing it, publicizing it, making it sort of an example um, of Nazi power and an example to the Czechs of futility of resistance. So I was at first interested in sort of why the violence was so extreme, and then I was really interested in what seemed to me to be a case of like cognitive dissonance in the Third Reich. Why do what is the purpose of destroying something on the one hand and then publicizing it on the other? Like, why are you trying to erase all traces of it and then you publicize it? And like commentators and journalists across the world noted, like nobody had heard about this village until the Nazis, went on Radio Prague and said, "Look at what we did," and and they were right. The Nazis made this town world famous, um, and it became, one of the sort of chief examples of Nazi violence during the war. It was cited a whole bunch of times in the Nuremberg trials as a kind of representative case of Nazi violence. So that was what first started me sort of looking at these sources. I was interested in sort of the German perspective, and then in the course of my research, I found all of these Lititzas around the world. And since I'm not actually a German historian, I'm an American historian, I started to focus more on that aspect and how the Allies had reacted to the violence, and why did it become this famous case? Why did they decide to rename all of these places and locations and even children after this village? So that's what got me interested, and that's sort of how the project has evolved.
Thank you.
I think we had a question in the chat from Laura, which was about next steps, or I mean, a kind of version of this is: do you know what is this? What is the situation in Lidice now? Has the territory been resettled, or have descendants of those of people that were killed there made their way back home, or does it continue to be kind of a wheat fielder, as you said? I think from the 40s.
Yeah, so there were some returning surviving women and children who managed to make their way back to Lidice. There were some excavations that started to take place when they built the new village. As I mentioned, the new village is not built in the same location. It's sort of built on one side, overlooking the field where the old village once stood. Some excavations uncovered the foundation stones of St. Martin's Church that was there, and those have been marked and designated. But the place where the old village stood is still just a field. I mean, it's rather picturesque, but it's yeah, there's really not much there. The memorial, the new village. I guess the memorial is in sort of the same location as the old village, but the new village is off to the side. Yeah. What's the next step? Where am I taking this now? I have never been to Lidice. I would love to go. For a long time during the Cold War, visitors reported that you sort of couldn't escape Lidice, that like anybody who went to Prague was kind of like, grabbed and hauled off to Lidice so they could hear this story. And residents, I mean, the village became kind of like this living museum, and residents were almost required to like tell their story of the village and what had happened. And so in the same way that like, today people go to like colonial Williamsburg and they can walk through and have, you know, actors and volunteers tell you about what life was like. In this case, like these were the real people, the real survivors, and um, I'm sure that was also like so traumatizing to them as well to have like tourists be brought to town and then have to like relive and re-explain what exactly went on. Um, but that has changed now. There's an actual museum there. It's actually run by the same organization that runs the Memorial for Theresienstadt, which is nearby. Um, but I would love to. I'm trying to get this piece published as an article. I'm also trying to start a digital humanities project so that I can map out all of the locations of the streets and the plazas and the towns that have been renamed, and then I could better share, you know, the photographs that I've found and the history that connects all of these different places. So that's the next step, hopefully.
When the time comes, maybe you can find some collaborators in our unit for some metadata and discoverability stuff. If you can get that thing off the ground.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Any other final questions for Andrew from anybody? All right. Well, I'm not seeing any. Thank you. Let me thank you on behalf of all of us, Andrew, for this really great talk. Just a reminder to other people, keep an eye out on social media for these lunch and learns. As you know, we tend to have them at least once a month or so. So we'll be sending out an announcement about any upcoming ones. We're definitely going to try to have Andrew back to talk about the POW MIA movement as it relates to Vietnam. It sounds like we just have to wait on some people above our pay grade to make those decisions. So
Just some bureaucratic red tape, you
that's
know.
right. We haven't heard anything about that recently, so I'm sure that things are running smoothly there.
Yeah.
All right, thanks again so much, and good seeing everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.